Hello and welcome to Dick and Cherry Show number 2, like we do it on the Discovery Channel. It is a continuation of our conversation from last month from Dick and Cherry Show number 1, so definitely give that a gander if you're interested in the greater conversation that we've been having on this topic. But just to give a little overview, what we covered is the difference between one-shot gaming theory, which is popularized by Nash, also known as Nash equilibrium, and you find it in economics quite frequently, versus the evolutionary game theory, which is a sort of an animal model evolutionary concept of how game theory works in groups, how it works within animal models, and how in fact, being more cooperative and altruistic within a group can be beneficial to the group in the long term more than the one-shot gaming theory. So we had a few videos that we watched on that regard, and they were left in the low bar as well of the last show, but I will be leaving them in a comment that's pinned to the top, or a low bar in here as well, so you can check out those videos for yourself. But if anyone wants to kind of go over some of the evolutionary game theory refreshers, just so we have kind of a base to start with, please go ahead. If I didn't cover it.
I figured we'd move on to what we had originally attempted to talk about, which was we were basically trying to talk about primate models, or the different models of human social behavior. And so I was kind of hoping we'd head towards that, which is why I gave you that huge list of links and stuff that you're going to, I guess, put in the low bar or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, well, essentially just giving them an overview of what game theory is and how it relates to group dynamics, because a lot of these behavioral models are informed by cooperative strategies and different types of cooperative strategies, which is the scientific and I guess mathematical basis of cooperative strategies. You find that in game theory.
Exactly. Basically, it's just a problem solving, trying to find the best way to interact in groups where both competition and cooperation have their different values, and then matching long-term versus short-term strategies. And then there's also, what's interesting is one of the things we're going to get into is the different social structures. And it turns out there's also different models that are better based on the size of the group. In other words, we've been exploring mathematically, discovering what is the best methods of cooperation and competition, and how those two interact with each other in a very complex set of situations. And so there, of course, it is different depending on the situation, and that's why we find different modes of cooperation versus competition in various sets of animals, such as one of the things that we had talked about kind of offline with Alison is the idea that that wolves or dogs are an interesting model for human behavior that people have been exploring. What I just found, kind of preparing for the show beforehand, is that one of the things that people are wanting to do now is to use dogs for some social behaviors, because just like if you have humans that are we have this, where we're very closely linked in genetics with chimpanzees. There's theoretically, there's like 6 million years of differentiation going on there, even though that it seems like a very small, portion of DNA that's different. But one of the things that is interesting though is that, okay, so we have these other primates that have, differentiated over that long period of time. Well, we also have that in dogs, where there is this other animal that is differentiated and or that also shares some of the same precursor genetics, and so you can compare them because they're both available, and you can compare them and see what the differences are. And so in using both dogs and wolves, we find there are these very specific differences in dogs and wolves, and one of them, I'll say two of them specifically are, and they're kind of linked, and that is in oxytocin and in basically using facial expressions. In other words, we find that dogs are much better at learning through looking at humans' faces, and in cooperative situations, they end up looking at humans' faces. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there with using the differentiation of dogs and wolves as kind of a way of looking at how it is that humans differentiated from the other non-human primates.
Yeah, the non-human primates that sort of preceded us prior to I suppose the agriculture, or even the hunter-gatherer revolutions. And I just wanted to add to what you were saying and say the reason why we look at dogs and wolves is there is that model of domestication. When you look at the dog versus the wolf, the dog is obviously, it has the same pattern of domestication that you see actually when you look at human beings versus Neanderthal. Well, we have the higher foreheads, the shorter jaws, the much lower bone density, and much lower muscular density, and the lower, and interestingly enough, the lower brain volume. So there's an interesting parallel going on between the domestication of the dog and what the differences between Neanderthals and humans. Now, I don't know for sure if that's been established as an anthropological fact, but it is something interesting to think about. And the reason why we do look at canid species, and not just wolves, but also foxes and wild dogs and other things, is because there's a sort of a parallel evolution going on. They occupy a similar niche to what anthropologists theorize early humans or even hominids occupied. So it's not that we share a great deal of genetic similarity with them. We share a niche, which makes a lot of sense when you think about they were the first animal that we domesticated. We were in the same niche.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I kind of tend to believe that it's not necessarily. A lot of times we imagine that we purposefully domesticated them, but I think there may have been a more of a symbiosis that occurred. Just like if you look at all these different sharks that always have the certain animals going along with them, or like you have a type of fish that's a cleaner wrasse that goes in and cleans the the larger fish's mouth, and things like that. That they from that perspective, you could think that they domesticated this servant animal because it's smaller than them and does things for them. But at the same time, perhaps instead of it being a domestication, which actually infers a sort of conscious effort, that instead there was a development of that they kind of grew together. And I tend to believe that that's probably how the domestication of dogs going back that far probably occurred, is more that we were living in the same niche and behaving in similar ways, and ended up finding advantages in basically growing together. And so there wasn't as much of a controlled, concerted effort, probably. But and like I said, this is kind of just in my opinion. I don't have any specific study or anything like that in mind. But it seems to be likely to me.
Yeah, well, I would agree that it is probably likely. I doubt it wasn't a conscious effort on either wolves or early humans to end up being domesticated. And I just wanted to just point out that it's good to have a discussion that takes the animal models beyond chimpanzees and other great apes, because there is science into using or that uses other types of animals, and then not even just dogs, but also prairie voles have been used as a model or a potential model for some of our behaviors, specifically pair bonding. So I just wanted to put that out there because it does seem like the discussion of animal models modeling human behavior seems to get stuck on the great apes when there are some really significant differences in our behavior.
Yeah, it's because it seems natural, and the thing is no single one of the models is going to work because we're not exactly the same. I mean, it kind of comes down to that. And the funny thing is, I mean, when you look at humans themselves, there's a great deal of differentiation between behaviors in humans. So to try to take one animal and use that as a model for all humans is absurd, of course, because you can't take one set of humans and use it as a really good model for the social behavior of all humans. So bringing in different ones and looking at how they may be useful in specific circumstances, I think is the kind of the mode that is I think that is what the I don't know what to call it, but basically that's what most people are thinking in academia is using these different things for different purposes. Like I was just reading about the specifics of the neuroscience of extinction of memories and the amygdala and things like that, because that is something that's very interesting to me, and actually talked about a little bit on some of the other shows, and I'll get into why that's important here, because what we find is the big difference between the wolves and the dogs. That there's even articles that are specifically, there's one big difference, and that is that using visual stimuli, specifically connecting with the face and eyes as a as a way of cooperating, as a way of judging, the other animal's internal state. And so we find that these differences in the amygdala, you can study that in a lot of different animals, because almost all mammals have similarities in these very basic brain structures. And like I said, the extinction of fear-based memories, usage of fear-based memories, and social learning, et cetera. That goes all the way down to mice. Basically, most gregarious animals have these similarities in the way that the amygdala is used, that you can, it's just once you start to try to get down to the fine details, then you have to start, switching models a little bit more. So you can find these general things that's true between, almost all animals that are mammalian, but then you have to, as you start to try to get into more specifics, then you kind of have to switch around a little bit and say, okay, are they in these behaviors, how close are they, and how close are they in the surrounding behaviors? And so, yeah, of course, there is definitely a good reason to. I think it's when they're trying to get to those finite details. That's when they try to go, well, let's try to pick one that's the closest genetically, and maybe let's see if that's gonna work for all these similar behaviors. But the big problem, of course, is that differentiation that has to do with our niche being different than the other great apes. And during that development time, and that's why the dogs and wolves model is really useful, because it's making up that difference. It's that specific area where we developed differently from these other animals, and then looking at what exactly are those differences, and why do we have the these differences in behavior. And there's a paper I linked in here that is really, really good about it. It's just basically the dog model for understanding human social behavior, and I've got that linked, and it's a really long paper that really gets into it really good. I recommend that anybody's interested in this topic just try to peruse some of that, and it gets into a lot of those details. So
yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you were saying. There is what I've seen from the work into dog cognition is that they're actually looking, interestingly enough, and I know there's certain other Honey Badger hosts that might be none too pleased with this, but interestingly enough, dogs may have more cognition, like more of a self-awareness, and you touched on it when you talked about visual cues. The study that I'm thinking of, and it'll probably pop in your mind when I explain it. The study I'm thinking of is a study on dogs playing and how they attend to the visual cues of their playmate to determine if they're an engaged playmate, or if they're a distracted playmate, or if they want to continue to play. So there's this new approach that's coming in anthropology to look at dogs as having a model of self-awareness. And they have almost given up on finding it in chimps. For example, if you put a bucket on your head, or if you have grapes and you offer the grapes to the chimps, and the chimps eat the grapes, and then they try to beg for more grapes, they will beg for grapes from someone with a bucket on their head and without a bucket, without distinguishing between the two. And yet, in a similar challenge to dogs, they actually successfully resolve it and seem to be able to understand that there's another mind outside of their own, which is, it's sort of interesting. It's interesting results.
Yeah, it's basically the social behaviors in cooperation are different. It's the way that we cooperate that really kind of separates them. And yeah, exactly. Some of the puppies will use each other's the cues in the facial expressions, and basically looking at the eyes and using visual cues that have to do with looking at eyes and things like that to determine social behavior. And it was funny, like I think it was in the play of Humans versus hold on a second, let me look through my links here. There was something that was really good along the lines of what you were talking about. Let's see if I can find that particular study here.
But I know that's it's rather counterintuitive, because primates seem to be so similar to us. But yeah, the attempts to find self-awareness among primates have been very mixed in results. So now there's a lot of scientists that are turning more towards dogs, And I mean, there is some sense to it, because dogs and humans, or wolves and humans, occupy very similar niches. I don't know if this is what science usually calls them, but I call humans and dogs, I think humans are called this, super predators. In other words, you don't have to genetically differentiate to exploit a new prey resource. Instead, both wolves and humans use social learning to exploit new prey resources. So they have almost a rudimentary culture around the prey resource that they exploit in particular. And so that it makes sense that they would have a more advanced theory of mind than apes, or who mostly just have exploited the same prey resource or food resources that they've always exploited. So that theory of mind allows them to model or pick up information from each other in a way that it isn't really necessary when you're dealing with the same environment over and over and over again. And that's the reason, the flexibility that kind of learning in a childhood, they have like a childhood, wolves have sort of a childhood, humans have sort of a childhood where they pick up extended learning about their environment. That allows for a great deal of dispersal.
Yeah, it's the social learning difference. Actually, they find that in humans, they'll learn things that they don't necessarily have to understand what's going on or the benefit of them. Whereas in some of the chimpanzees and others, they won't learn anything if it's not readily apparent how it connects and how it's useful. So that was one of the ways in which humans were differentiated, and that ability to just the funny thing is, it's basically magical thinking. In other words, it's like, I don't need to know exactly how I got there. I just know that it's beneficial. Lots of other people are doing it. And so I'm just going to do it to get because I know that this behavior gets this thing. I don't need to know how. And that was actually differentiated between humans and chimps.
That's interesting. But yeah, it's in that extended period of learning, this additional socialization allows both humans and wolves to exploit almost every single ecological niche on the planet. That's why you'll find a dog almost everywhere except Antarctica. Antarctica is the only place that only humans are. But everywhere that you find a human, you find a dog species or a wolf species or a sub-wolf species, because coyotes and I think even foxes are actually part of the same species. They're just slightly differentiated, like Chihuahuas are differentiated from Mastiffs and stuff like that. And so it's that extended period of learning that allows dogs to be all over the place and humans to be all over the place as well. Yeah, and again, that's why they're being considered more strongly for a human model. Okay, do you have anything additional? Like, I'm sort of running out of.
Oh yeah, well, I was going to back up a little bit. Did I find the specific study? Well, the thing is, I realized it instead of just it's in one of the numerous links that I put up there, but I ended up kind of going across so many different things because there's this picture of social learning and group size that I've been putting together, that I've actually mentioned before, like I said in the previous shows, the cherry stem shows, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that because I linked a study here where, no, actually there's just an article where they're talking about how autism is selected positively for because they found that the autistic traits are actually improved cognition. In other words, there's a relationship between the improved cognition in humans and and academic achievement, etc., and the autistic traits, which really doesn't come as much as a surprise when you actually think of autistic savants, etc. But then what I've been trying to get people to kind of notice is this role that there is this that instead of autism being a dysfunction, that instead it needs to be seen as a differentiation, and this connection of dogs and I'm trying to put together that dogs, you'll find that this differentiation that they have is similar to the difference between more autistic versus less autistic in the association of the amygdala, which is the social learning, and specifically oxytocin levels. And so the thing is, wolves operate in smaller groups, and and one of the things that you can kind of associate it with autism is a lack of use of facial recognition cues, etc., for social learning. And they also, if you kind of put this together with the operation of smaller groups, you find that basically that there's a difference in what the animals are paying attention to. And I'm trying to relate all of these things, so you have to excuse me as I jump around a little bit and stop me if it's starting to, get too far afield, and just ask me what the hell I'm talking about. But so what I'm saying here is that in humans, what we find is that males and females basically are differentiated along this autistic spectrum line. And that is the idea I'm trying to get across here is that the amygdala is not just social learning, but it is very strongly implicated in attention. In other words, what it is that you find to be attentive to. What do you need to attend to? And if we look at our idea of hunter gatherers, where the females were operating in larger groups in gathering, and men were operating in the smaller groups of hunters going off in just the amount. There's a balance in group size and how large of animal you can take down versus how much reward for each of the individuals that was involved in taking down that animal determines the group size of cooperative animals like wolves, for instance. So getting back to the idea of a differentiated amygdala. So one of the things that we find in the difference between male and female brains is this differentiated amygdala, and it is along the whole autistic spectrum. And then when you find when autistic spectrum becomes extreme, they are they don't look people in the eye. They have a hard time with remembering faces, so there's basically a social dysfunction there. But what I'm saying is I believe that instead of it, it's only dysfunctional when it becomes extreme. And I think that the difference between these two mindsets, it can be categorized in one of the functions of the amygdala, which is what you attend to as important. In other words, what your brain decides is important to pay attention to. And I can go down the line here in the various studies, but let me try to lay out the general idea here a little bit. And that is specifically that if you are more attentive to social cues, and in social behaviors, the behaviors of human beings or other animals or anything like that, when it comes to behaviors, those are things that are of the mental realm that can be very fuzzy. In other words, the physical realm, it's very binary in nature many times. The switch is either up or down. Something is there or isn't there. There's not really a fuzzy thing there. There's not a lot of mutual exclusivity. Whereas in social situations, there is a lot of mutual exclusivity, but something both is and isn't true to various degrees. People both do things and don't do things in the exact same situation, and so there's a lot of unreliability in when you're attempting to figure out social situations. And so the way in which you look at patterns, say for instance, you're trying to best decide how to use a given system. If you are focused on social systems, then you're going to have to be able to pattern recognize things that have a tremendous amount of overlap and a tremendous amount of apparent mutual exclusivity. Whereas when you are trying to see the way that reality works, in other words, like the physical world and how, when I throw a spear or when I'm chasing animals, mutual exclusivity typically doesn't really, it's very hard line. In other words, it is this or it is not. And there's a lot more logic based ideology in the way that you deal with the physical world as opposed to the way that you deal with the mental world. And even the way in which you store things is vastly different. In other words, like for instance, in mathematical ability, 2 + 2 is true if you're standing on your head, you're on a mountain, it's always true. It's always the same thing. Whereas when two people, when a person says a certain thing or does a certain thing or whatever, it is extremely context dependent if you're attempting to manipulate a social environment. In other words, what they do has a meaning that is very context dependent. So you don't get to just save that information of 2 + 2 and I can always use it the same way regardless of the situation. Instead, I have to save all of the information about this given situation along with that particular interaction. And so the way in which you store data, I'm looking at this just from like a systems design approach, computer programming. The way in which you would store the data is different. And the way in which you would use your pattern recognition system would be very wide open and very overlapping in one case, whereas in another case, you would be strongly looking for mutual exclusivities, and there would be a tremendous amount of overlap and reuse of given circumstances. So what I'm saying is that I believe that these two mindsets are kind of mutually exclusive in that each one confers. You can have, if you have benefit in one, you kind of have deficit in the other. They are there's a tendency for them to be mutually exclusive. Now, I'm not saying it's completely binary, but I'm saying that they're the more you lean towards one or the other, the more that you're either pattern matching things that overlap a whole lot, or you're being very fastidious in the way in which you look at things and say, okay, this is a good pattern that is extremely well pruned, and I'm not bringing in a bunch of very unreliable data. And so basically what I'm trying to get at is that there's these two different ways of doing things, and it seems to be very much based upon the size of groups. In other words, like the size of the group determines how important it is and how much of your life depends upon interaction with a group, as opposed to how much of your life depends upon interaction with physical reality. And as groups get larger, of course, your survival is far more dependent upon the group, because the way in which they keep the way in which they gather resources, the way in which they share resources or do not, and so it's an interesting perspective to look at this difference between the way in which dogs versus wolves interact, and the way in which more modern humans may interact versus others, and how we may be there's been a recent kind of uptick in the autistic spectrum, and it may be that because of our use of certain systems that we basically are tending to have brains that function better for certain tasks, which are more logical, rational, etc. But I think that at the same time, we may be having a tendency towards an extremity of the opposite happening as well. In other words, those the entire way in which their brain works is much more socially defined, and so there may be kind of I'm saying there's kind of it seems to be a bifurcation that I'm personally noticing. Now this is my own take on things, but I did want to bring up some of the things that I'd run into here in looking through some of it. Going back to what
I think people are waiting. People are waiting for your conclusion that dogs are autistic.
No, actually, I think that that what you'll find is that wolves are a little more autistic spectrum type than dogs are. Hold on just a second. Did you want to say something?
Were you referring to me or Anna?
No, I think Cherry's I think she's muted or something. Something's not coming through. Hold on.
Yeah, she does seem to be having difficulties. We can't hear you at all, Anna, even when you unmute. So nobody's been actively trying to silence you, just passively.
Yeah, I think I think she's still
Google's passively trying to passively trying to silence you.
Yes.
Yeah, so people are pretty excited now that we've come to the conclusion. Yes, well, no, is slightly modified. It's not dogs that are autistic; it's wolves that are autistic relative to dogs.
Well, the thing is, it's a smooth continuum. It's not, binary. You are autistic or you are not. That's why you have Asperger's and you have various, and that's why you can actually say that men are lean more towards autistic spectrum than women do. And instead of, because what we find when we actually lesion the amygdala, when there is actually damage to the amygdala, then there's a loss of function that is not like autism. In other words, autism is not like damage to the amygdala, which makes it where you have problems with attention, have problems in memory, and so instead of seeing autistic spectrum as a dysfunction, we need to instead see it as a differentiation in a different model that is equally useful for given certain circumstances.
But that's an interesting, it has an interesting implication because dogs are, of course, the domesticated form of wolves. So maybe autistic people are the non-domesticated form of humans.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it seems kind of like it. But I think what it is it has to do with being better in smaller groups. In other words, the people who are a little more, they may be better adapted to smaller groups. I don't know if she's got her problem fixed yet. Have you gotten your problem fixed there with the mute chair?
Apparently
nope,
not.
Look like it.
Okay.
Okay, we'll have to see what we can do about this because this stinks.
It's coming through on my end. It's showing little bars that I'm speaking.
Oh yeah, it's not coming through to us at all.
It's not coming through except by cross when you showed it, Richard's station, I guess.
I can see the little green activation on my screen, but you guys apparently can't, which makes absolutely no sense. All right then.
All right.
All right.
I'm getting so butthurt.
All the butthurt.
Yeah, it's just fuming.
We're just like running her over.
Nope. This is the non-Anna hour. It's just gonna be.
It's like, yeah, we're just gonna pay no attention to you and just run you over. Take that. Ha.
Well, if you get that fixed, I imagine you'll have a lot saved up to speak on.
So
I wanted to
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. All right, then I'll go ahead. I wanted to point one thing out that was interesting. From Hunting with Wolves, humans conquered the world, and there's a new theory that the pair up between humans and wolves actually was what caused the Neanderthal extinction, because the wolves gave us such an advantage over the Neanderthals' hunting methods that we either out-hunted them into extinction or we actually actively killed them. But in conjunction with that theory is another theory that's about our white. We have white scleras. I think that's how you say it. Essentially, it's the white around the iris of our eyes, and what that facilitates is us seeing what each other is looking at. And there are no other great apes that actually have this feature. This is pretty unique to us. It's completely unique to us, in fact. And like I said, what it facilitates is that theory of mind, knowing what other humans are looking at. And what's interesting is that wolves have the same feature. So part of the theory is that wolves actually changed the color of our scleras to white instead of black. And it's delineated by a book called The Invaders: How Humans and Their Dogs Drove Neanderthals to Extinction, by someone called Shipman. I don't know his first name. Her first name, sorry. And she says, the main advantage of having white sclera is that it's very easy to work out what another person is gazing at. It provides a very useful form of nonverbal communication that would have been of immense help to early hunters. They would have been able to communicate silently but effectively. Thus, the mutation.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Conferring white sclera could have been increasingly common among modern humans for 40,000 years ago, and would have conferred an advantage on those who were hunting with dogs. And that would be interesting, because that would mean that Neanderthals had black instead of whites to their eyes. They had blacks. Oh, that would be so creepy.
Yeah, that would look creepy as shit. But we do have some level of Neanderthal blood in like most of us. I think I know that my family has some Neanderthal blood. I just don't know. I think it's like some small amount. Yeah.
I want to do a shout out on the book again, because someone asked. The Invaders: How Humans and Their Dogs Drove Neanderthals to Extinction. So that's the book. It's by a woman whose last name is Shipman, and I do not know her first name, so I apologize for that.
I think Cherry may be back.
Yeah, how's my?
Yes, there we go.
Oh, okay. All right.
You're definitely back.
Excellent.
So I assume that you now have plenty to talk about.
Really, honestly, not really. One thing I wanted to say way earlier on, but then Richard Rall actually kind of covered it a little bit, which was I kind of want to talk about matriarchy, and for that, which will be next show. But for that, it is essential that we go back to primates. So it's like, well, how do we resolve that? How do we resolve the fact that we just covered this idea of going to other animal models? Because you're right, we do use prairie voles and we do use mice for genetic memory, and we do use a lot of other animals. But then, how do we sort of go back to using primates for matriarchy and size and all that? So I think what we have both things. We have a struggle between interpersonal sort of me monkey, so me have monkey thoughts, versus being in group, and then we have more wolf-like or other mechanics that we developed as groups, as hunters. Therefore, we have similar patterns and behaviors as other groups of hunters that cooperate, like wolves. And then we also start looking into what do humans have. We have vasopressin for males and oxytocin for women. That's like the bonding hormones in mating, pair bonding. And that's what prairie voles have. They use vasopressin in unique ways that have to do with their bonding. So we have these basically three different ways of looking at things. Like, are we looking at the exact chemical and the exact genetic memory element? Because if so, then let's look at like mice, let's look at voles, it doesn't matter. Are we looking at group mechanics? If so, well, yeah, let's look at other group hunters. Are we looking at male versus female primate genetics? Then we need to look at primates. So I think it definitely depends on what we're trying to figure out about ourselves as mammals. And there's different ways of looking at things and different other models we can pull in based on the scale of things that we're looking at. And so I think we can bring it back to primates when it comes to our size difference between male and female, about how we, the fact that we are very similar to monkeys genetically. So when it comes to our instincts and that have to do with breeding and all of that a lot of that will be monkey related. So that was basically my point, kind of that I wanted to mention that it's just different ways of looking at things, and all of them matter, but none of them are necessarily lesser than others. It just depends on what we're trying to suss out.
I have to offer a disagreement respectfully. I think in terms of our actual sexual behavior, wolves are a much closer match than chimpanzees. And the reason why I say that is wolves have pair bonding like we do. They also engage in almost every single arrangement of sexual relationship as you see in human societies. So there are multiple male, multiple female groups where multiple males and multiple females mate. There's one male, multiple females. There's one female, multiple males. There are monogamy. There's also even some larger wolf packs in which there are multiple breeding pairs involved. And there's also,
I think if you're taking just one species versus one species, whereas, I mean, because all of those things exist throughout various primate.
Right. I think it's about ultimately, do wolves have a matriarchy or do they have a patriarchy? How do they have an alpha male and an alpha female, and then the rest are kind of underneath them. And that's kind of the central idea of wolves. And that's not precisely how humans do it necessarily. And there's this idea of like overarching matriarchy, overarching patriarchy, and I don't think wolves necessarily do that as much as other primates. But I think Richard Rall was actually going somewhere with that before I interrupted.
Well, I do have a bunch of studies that I linked to you that have to do with like studies in how male bonding is basically responsible for how primates live in larger groups. I mean, but when it comes to like the way in which you have the various, I mean, the difference between let's see, chimpanzees versus bonobos is the sexual relations between them. And there, most people, if they looked at a chimpanzee or a bonobo, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless you really, happen to have, looked into this. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference visually and genetically. There's such a minor difference that there's just like this one tiny little thing that it's even hard to find the study where we found that humans may be closer related to bonobos than chimps, but they're practically the same species, but their mating behaviors behaviors are just radically different. And so yeah, when it comes down to, if you're just trying to pick one species and just going just for chimpanzees, yeah, that's definitely problematic. If you're just go doing chimpanzees and thinking that they're going to be the best model for our sexual behavior, that's just absurd. And so definitely have to agree with you there on that, Alison. But I think that we may have been speaking about two different things perhaps. But
yeah,
so
well, perhaps, yeah, because I think from what I remember from when I took my anthropology course, there was a lot of how different societies like bonobos versus chimps organize themselves, whether the females or the males groom other females, other males more, and stuff like that. That's definitely applicable to certain aspects of the socialness of us. But I wanted to round out some more of wolf behavior. It's not just that they have all of these things. They have all of these things in one species. They tend towards being reproducing in monogamous pairs. Like us, even in societies where polygamy is allowed, the vast majority of relationships are monogamous between a man and a woman. So that's a strong tendency that both species shares. And yet on top of that, we also have this flexibility where there's a certain minority where that go into these different sort of arrangements, family arrangements. And I just wanted to point out that the biologists who study wolves are sort of getting away from using the terms alpha and beta and those kinds of terms, because what's really happening is generally the wolves who are in charge are the mother and father. So calling them alpha doesn't really add anything other than saying this is the mother, this is the father, because that's generally how it works. It's the wolf pack will be their children. Sometimes they'll be their brothers and sisters. But for the most part, it's just a breeding pair and their children.
Oh, that's actually, you brought up something really interesting in my mind just now. You are describing how humans used to be and how they're not any longer. So we might have actually gone from a wolf model back to a primate model, because we used to live in like this frontier families, right? You literally had a family and that's it. You had like one little house, one little family, and you had like 20 kids, because 5 of them would die, but then you also need a workforce. And that's how little armies would start back in the day. It would just be your sons, but now it seems like we're all like stuffed together we have both still, obviously, but civilization has brought humans into clumps together where all families are clumped into one big thing, more like primates. So maybe we're actually hitting onto something there with how humans human density, and how we used to be in family units, and now we're a lot more in just a mishmash group.
Yeah, and one thing to point out here is that a lot genes do not basically if you have these genes, they only have one model of anything. There's something called epigenetics, where basically that allows within a given animal's lifetime to change which turn on and turn off various genes. And so it's kind of a selector based on circumstances that if we have all of these various various animal solutions. So say for instance, you're the programmer, who's designing, animals, then there's all these, of course, let's not put any kind of intent here, but I'm just saying that that nature tends to come to the best design. And so the best design would be to have the ability to choose a model that worked in a given circumstance, and if the circumstance changes, to be able to switch models. So there would definitely be what we found is stress modulates our epigenetic profile, as various stresses or various circumstances can change which set of genes you turn on and turn off, and that could be from a set of very genes that tend towards aggression towards those that are less aggressive, a wide variety of things. So I think that what you're saying there does have merit in the idea that we may switch between various models.
Yeah, definitely we would. I think what's really facilitated a switch, and I'm not exactly sure how much of the switch is just in the West, because they recently did a worldwide study to figure out what level of monogamy, genetic monogamy, people have, and they found pretty high. I think it was between 75 or 95 and 98% of the children fathered around the world were fathered by the presumptive Like
Really, I'd
the
like to look
social
into
father.
that because I think I remember there being a surprisingly high number.
Oh
Of,
yeah, there is. Except
yeah, that where it's basically the
the
extra pair, thing was really
well,
way
yeah,
higher than one expected.
there is, but it's a qualification. It's only the numbers that I found that are fairly high are um in a population that suspects that the paternity isn't accurate. So the social father isn't the genetic father. That in that case, I've found I think 70% were found to be the social father was the genetic father, and then 1/3 was not. And this isn't to take away from the tragedy that is false paternity, but it is not it's not as common as it's made out to be in some groups. Like some groups overinflate the numbers. And by way of comparison, human genetic monogamy is actually very high. For mammals, more common is, if you look at the beavers who engage in social monogamy, more common, interestingly enough, they're about 30% genetically monogamous. So only 30% of the social father is also the genetic father.
Yeah, and it does confer a specific advantage. Is why there's a.
Oh yes, it does.
We used to think that all these birds are all monogamous, and these are monogamous, and that is monogamous, and they're just socially monogamous, and they're actually very promiscuous when it comes to genetics. In other words, it's the social monogamy that is much more crucial and confers an advantage, whereas the genetic monogamy ends up being genetic monogamy can actually end up conferring disadvantages because of the lack of genetic diversity.
Definitely.
When so there's an interesting interplay at work there. I wanted to read off. Go ahead.
Or sorry, with beavers, it's really a situation where even if you're taking care of Ted's kids, Ted is probably taking care of yours, because it's so, like, the breeding colony is so small. It's basically everybody's related to everyone. But like I said, with beavers, it's 70%. That's pretty typical for mammals. What you look at when you look at human beings just generally, not a particular population that suspects paternity fraud. When you look at human beings generally, it's a very high rate of genetic monogamy and a very unusually high rate of genetic monogamy. And there's reasons why species don't engage in high rates of genetic monogamy, and that's because generally that results in genetic defects. So I actually had this theory that maybe the reason why, in conjunction with our high genetic monogamy, there's a tendency for women to shove off blighted ovums every month. It takes a fairly long time for humans to reproduce. Like the average couple, 8 months to a year to actually achieve a fertile conception. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that another way to look at it. I mean, let me let you finish what you were saying there, because I'm sorry, I may have jumped the gun.
Well, what I was going to say is maybe that's an adaptation to, because sperm competition generally introduces, it introduces sperm fitness with other animals, and that's why female animals and other species will engage in extra pair couplings to increase the fitness of the sperm, so that the conception is as good as it can get. With humans, without that sperm competition, and there is sperm competition, but it's not as high as with chimpanzees. With that without that sperm competition, you're left with a situation where you have to flush conceptions that aren't going to work, that have genetic abnormalities, and that's why I'm suggesting that we have not only that it takes eight months to a year for a real, like a healthy conception to occur, but that we are also basically ovulating and maybe are engaging in maybe having a conception each month, but we're flushing it because of the genetic abnormalities, and that is an accommodation to our high rates of genetic. Yeah, it might be a little rarefied for people.
Yeah, I'd like to see the information you're going off of, because that is an interesting thing to look at, because I want to see the studies when it comes to the monogamy. Because here's the thing: if we're to look at it from the best solution type of perspective, the way that a species would best be served when it comes to genetic monogamy versus being more prolific in their breeding, is that it has to do with, just like you had said before, everybody's related to everybody else in a highly non-monogamous situation if it's an enclosed area. Well, the thing is, what you want is to be able to have specialization and generalization. If you have just generalization, then everybody's related to each other. If you just have just specialization, then everybody's related to each other. So in other words, I think there's two forms of ways in which you end up with everybody having the same genes breeding with each other and having inbreeding. And that is, for instance, if you're on an island, if everybody is making sure to really, mix their genes around, that everybody has the same genes. And you never have the genetic, specialization. In other words, where certain genes become more, it allows for certain, what's it called? I don't want to call it deformations or anything like that, but basically alterations in genes, where certain genes are allowed time to become stronger and it in either confer advantage strongly or confer disadvantage strongly before they're mixed back into the group again. And so in other words, I think that any species would best be served by having cycles of monogamy versus what's the opposite? But not polygamy, but I'm not. I can't think of the word right now. But the point is that I think that you may end up finding that is going to be, if that's the best solution, then that is what is probably happening, and that's why you would have these examples of groups that become extremely monogamous, and then the exact same group you may find at other times they're highly they're breeding with a lot of the group. And I think it may be that this generalization versus specialization and the necessity of avoiding everybody having the same genes requires that cycling phenomena.
Sorry, I was actually putting a link to my source on the genetic monogamy. In essentially what they found is that 1 in 25 men is not the father of his children. In general, around the world, in populations that aren't actually looking to determine whether or not paternity or determine paternity. So that's about, I think, 3.7% is what they cited in the article. It's still high enough that I would imagine if they did routine paternity testing in a hospital, I mean, consider how many women or, how many children go through a hospital. 1 in 25 is going to end up being a tragedy. I can imagine even that would create a situation where they wanted to stop doing it. But I just, I'm not, like I said, my theory about ovulation and blighted ovum is just that, a theory. And I don't have any specific evidence for it or against it. So I can't say that it is true.
Yeah, we're just talking about interesting ideas, and that's what the truth of the matter is, proto-science is not based on like you may have some evidence, but the idea is putting together patterns and saying, hey, this is worthy of investigating. It's not saying this is true. I mean, we're not saying this is true. We're saying, hey, this is worthy of looking into and finding if there's some evidence that goes against it, or if there's something that's what we're doing is having a discussion. It's a little different than doing science. I would say.
So is there anything, like, I can look through my notes and see if there's anything more to bring up about this. I do have one other study which might offend people. It's called "Can Your Dog Read Your Mind?" They weren't literally talking about canine telepathy, although that is interesting, but it's outside the scope of this. Understanding the causes of canine perspective taking. So in this,
perspective taking, that's right, in cooperation. Yep.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the author says is, well, there's 3 authors. 1 is a man and 2 are women. So I don't know how the protocol there. Okay, what they say. Even more astounding are the repeated successful demonstrations of theory of mind abilities in dogs, while evidence of theory of mind like skills in non-human primates has been much more elusive. So it does indicate that they are looking for theory of mind in dogs, which some people might not be happy with that. Some people might be happy with it. You never know. But depends on how much they like dogs.
I don't see why anyone would be unhappy about that. I know you mentioned in the beginning that there's a HBR host that may disagree with you. What was that about?
Oh, Mike has he doesn't particularly. Well, I don't know if he doesn't. I won't say he doesn't like dogs. I think what I'm getting from him is he doesn't like some of the behavior, or some of the things that people have done to dogs, in terms of distorting their bodies, creating dogs that are unhealthy genetically, you know, stuff like that. So I was being slightly facetious. Don't quote me on saying that Mike hates dogs, because I don't think he does.
That's it. Mike hates dogs. Everybody spread the news.
Alison said Mike. No, it's
You heard
understandable.
it here first. News at 11.
Yeah, you see a vulnerable creature that puts all its trust in you, that, you know, relies on you, and then, you know, you have a responsibility to that creature to honor it. It's basically like with submission. When someone submits, you have a responsibility to honor that and to treat them well. And I can see where some anger or issues could come from about treatment of a vulnerable species, so to speak.
Yeah, and dogs are particular. Well, you know, cats can be vulnerable too. There's a lot of manipulation of their appearance. Like recently, I was looking at these doll face versus flat faced Persians. I'm like, well, who the hell would want this flat faced creature?
Persians have breathing problems as well, just like pugs. They definitely do that as well.
And then I find out you guys have a flat faced Persian or something.
Oh, we don't. We have a Siberian tuxedo cat.
Oh,
He's fluffy, but he's I don't even know where he came from. I think he came from a farm. And our first one was a rescue. He's really, really neurotic, really, really intelligent. Has an eating disorder, but
eating disorder. A cat with an eating disorder.
He chews plastic uncontrollably, and anytime there's any kind of food, particularly dry food, he will just utterly gorge himself on it like a dog. He is a cat dog. He will just continue eating and eating and eating until he's like 20 pounds. So yeah, I blame it on the fact that he supposedly was found as a kitten in an abandoned house. So I think he may have starved a bit as a baby. So yeah.
Someone corrected me and said it's peaky face. just so you know, I don't want to be accused of not knowing my cat breeding terms. And also, it was Crazy Cat Gentleman, who I appreciate greatly for oh shit, sorry, I didn't mean to thank you again. I'll stop doing that. Anyway, no, it was Crazy Cat. It was Crazy Cat Gentleman who informed me that it's peaky face. But I think that the doll face Persians are a lot prettier, and they don't have the problems that the flat face Persians have. But this is definitely a digression.
Very much.
Well, one thing I was going to bring back in, just aside from the digression, was specifically I did link it in the set of links that I gave out, was that oxytocin receptor gene polymorphisms are associated with human-directed social behavior. So there is very specific links in some of the things I was talking about the the oxytocin, amygdala, and social behavior in dogs and humans, etc. And one thing that is interesting, of course, going along with that, is they find that when they look at the dog breed differences in visual communication with humans, which is another study I linked there, they actually found that ancient breeds that are closer to wolves use the human gaze less. So it's not just wolves, and there is this progression from wolves using the human gaze much less, and then dogs using it more and more depending upon their level of domestication.
Cool. It's all interesting stuff. And I assume the next episode, I've been diligently reading the stuff in the side chat. So matriarchy.
Yes, that is the idea. We will be. That's like the last sort of bit I have on pair bonding and animal models. Is I found a lot of really interesting body dimorphism, and how basically the fact that males are bigger than females in those species that are sexually dimorphic. A lot of that actually ties into some interesting female-dominated or matriarchy sort of behaviors. And in fact, there's a surprisingly large amount of matriarchies out there, as opposed to what feminism would like us to believe. So I would really like to cover some of that stuff next time. And then after that, we'll be doing a show on epigenetics and genetic memory, because I did actually very briefly touch upon it in our first Dick and Cherry show, which I did link in the low bar. It was the Way Nothing But Mammals one. And I do mention epigenetics just very briefly, but I like to go over that because we do have an ability to have different behaviors within the same genetic model based on the environment. The environment, that's kind of where the nature versus nurture thing comes from, is we do have genes that are nature, but then nurture or environment changes those genes, and we have the ability within the genes to be adaptive to different environments, such as a desert or a tropical forest, and the resource scarcity or abundance that goes with it. And that also I guess trickles down into relations between groups, and it kind of goes back around to evolutionary theory, and that when you have situations of scarcity, people are less cooperative, et cetera, et cetera. There's just a lot that ties it all together there.
And if we're talking about genetic memory, we can talk
Yeah.
about the linguistic characteristics of non-coding DNA.
Yes, which is the title of his published article in a paper. And also we'll talk about animal models that are not primate, because we found recently really interesting and compelling genetic memory evidence from mice. In fact, I think Joe Rogan and Gavin McInnes covered it in their recent podcast, oddly enough. But yeah, it's a thing that exists, and I'd like to cover that as well in our fourth show. So next one will be matriarchy, and the one after that will be going to genetics and epigenetics. So,
or so we think, because it turns out that we tend to just talk about what we want to talk about, regardless of the goddamn subject.
Well, I think we did a good job today.
Yeah, we
did good, but I know. But
We didn't get to the voles.
I think it's fun to just talk about what you want to talk about with a kind of a general idea of what you think you're going to talk about. That's good. I like it.
Well,
We didn't actually get to the voles, but we got to the wolves.
Oh, it's okay. I think the voles will actually potentially come into play in the matriarchy, since I don't have, necessarily a whole hour to talk about it. I mean, I could, but we could also talk about vasopressin and oxytocin and, actual bonding in mammals and, variety of mammals, I guess. But when it comes to like, what are the bonding hormones, like oxytocin, vasopressin?
Don't get me going on oxytocin. That's
Sure, that could be its own subject.
Yeah, right there.
Well, I also have to talk about vasopressin then.
Yeah, you may hold on to that the vole study for the bonding talk.
Yeah, there's this weird relationship between oxytocin and vasopressin, where it's like it's both species have the oxytocin, and then I'm not sure I've sussed out the real reason why you have the vasopressin, because the vasopressin does a lot of other stuff too. It has to do with like blood pressure and some what's it called, stress response, and so there's some interesting things going on there with specifically vasopressin. But both males and females have oxytocin, and vasopressin, of course, is very strongly linked to oxytocin. So maybe I'll do a little research beforehand, and we'll be able to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. I think Alison has a thing to do, and we'll be opening up the show to patrons, and we'll be chatting about random studies there. So if you want to continue the conversation, definitely look into becoming a patron. And that is both available through patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. There's a Patreon tier for that. And specifically for Cherry STEM and Dick and Cherry shows, there is a Patreon reward level on patreon.com/AnnaCherry. Choose which one you want.
Hey, I was going to say one thing. Hey, you promised me that Alison said that we were going to talk about the Michael Morley experiment. I want to do that. When do I get to do that? That's really my thing. I mean, okay, I love the neuroscience stuff, but
well, we have a lot of topics to get through, and then after we finish the animal models, we got to talk about technology. How technology is driven by porn.
Yes, that's so. Porn. Yeah, we finished the mammals bit, then we talk about VR, tech, porn, future, and then we'll go for into physics from there. I love it. Sounds good.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan.
Yes, we'll hopefully stick to it. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us, both to my co-hosts as well as all of the lovely viewers that we've had. And thanks for commenting and such. And look into the low bar. I have updated the information that was sent to me. So that's all available there. And we're going to be closing up the broadcast and opening it up to patrons. So thank you once again for listening, and we will see you guys in a few weeks.